Hello and welcome to the Lincoln Journey. We're on part 12 of the Conspirators, the story of the Lincoln assassination. Okay, we've been with Mary Surratt and other alleged conspirators in D.C. Where did we leave the chief conspirator, the moving spirit of the conspiracy, the most infamous murderer in U.S. history? We left John Wilkes Booth and his companion and co-conspirator, David Herold, on the wrong side of the Potomac River, after Davy rode all night on April 20th trying to get to Virginia. Southern sympathizer John Hughes, an acquaintance of Herold's, fed them but was afraid to shelter them. One source says he let them stay in a slave shack. A different source says they spent another night under the stars in that cold and wet April. And another night, possibly because Davy was exhausted from 5 hours of rowing on the night of the 20th, the pair didn't try to cross the Potomac again until the night of the 22nd. The mix-up on the river and the delay in the second attempt cost them valuable time. The wanted poster with their names and photographs was put in circulation on the 20th. Dr. Mudd had admitted to treating Booth by now, so searchers were told that Booth was on crutches and had shaved his mustache. Booth and Herold successfully crossed the Potomac on the night of the 22nd. With help from members of the Confederate underground, including Thomas Harbin, one of the earliest members of the kidnapping conspiracy, they eventually reached the home of a cousin of Robert E. Lee, Dr. Richard Stewart. But Stewart was too frightened to treat or shelter the disheveled strangers, whom he suspected, quote, might be some of the characters who had been connected with the vile acts of assassination, unquote, as he later explained. After giving them a meal, he directed them to a nearby African-American family living in a one-room house. Forcing themselves into the William Lucas home around midnight and brandishing the Bowie knife that sorely injured Major Henry Rathbone, Booth and Herold finally got to sleep in a bed. Lucas and his family spent the night on the front step. In the morning, Lucas's son Charlie drove them 10 miles to the ferry at Port Conway, and Booth paid the price that William Lucas quoted to him for the hire of his wagon and team, $20 in paper money. Then Booth decided to pay another debt. He asked Charlie to wait while he wrote a letter, which he gave to Charlie to deliver. It was a caustic note to Dr. Stewart, which started so: "Forgive me, but I have some little pride. I hate to blame you for your want of hospitality. You know your own affairs. I was sick and tired, with a broken leg, in need of medical advice. I would not have turned a dog from my door in such a condition." He continued in this vein before explaining that he was enclosing $2.50 for the meal that Dr. Stewart had given them. Meanwhile, Booth and Herold had to get over another river. This crossing would prove much easier than crossing the Potomac, but it would also prove to be their undoing. The river was the Rappahannock, a waterway that is very familiar to Civil War buffs. The crossing was within 30 miles or so of battlefields like Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, the Wilderness, and Spotsylvania Courthouse. Great armies no longer passed to and fro over the Rappahannock, but small groups of soldiers were on the move, trying to get home in the weeks after the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. Our conspirators were waiting for the ferry in Charlie Lucas's wagon when 3 Confederate soldiers approached. As usual, the irrepressible Davy Herold did the talking for the fugitives. He said they were brothers, John D. and David E. Boyd, and claimed they were soldiers heading south to continue the struggle. When the real soldiers replied cautiously and non-committally, Davy pulled 18-year-old Willie Jett aside and said, "I take it for granted that you are raising a command to go south to Mexico, and I want you to let us go with you." This sounded like crazy talk to Jett, who finally asked, "Who are you?" His facade crumbling, Herold came clean. "We are the assassinators of the president," he confessed. He pointed at Booth and proclaimed, "Yonder is the assassinator. Yonder is J. Wilkes Booth, the man who killed the president." This, by the way, will be the first scene in my movie version of The Conspirators, which will be told from Davy Herold's point of view. Anyway, at this point, Booth struggled over on his crutches and drew his pistol, saying, "Yes, I am John Wilkes Booth, the slayer of Abraham Lincoln, and I am worth just $175,000 to the man who captures me." It was $50,000 on the wanted poster that was out, but there were some other rewards that were circulating. His coolness and the way he bore his obvious pain impressed the trio of soldiers, and they agreed to assist the pair. Jet even asked Booth for his autograph. J. Wilkes wrote him a poem instead. The soldiers were from the neighborhood, and once they ferried across the Rappahannock from Port Conway to Port Royal, they accompanied Booth and Herold to 3 homes before finding one willing to give shelter to wounded Confederate soldier John Boyd. Richard Garrett was a prosperous farmer who was grateful that his 2 eldest sons had just returned home alive from the war, so he gladly offered to put up another veteran for a couple of days at his house. Soon Booth was sitting down to dinner with Garrett's large family. Playing the part of an imaginary soldier, he spent the night in the bed of one of the genuine veterans while the recently demobilized John and William Garrett shared the other bed. Herold went on with Jet and his companions to a nearby town, saying he wished to buy some shoes, and where he spent the night. After nearly 10 days on the run, most of it spent out in the elements, Booth and Herold were back in civilization, eating decent meals, sleeping in comfortable beds. Who can blame them for getting a little careless? Herold, who was familiar with the region and could effect an escape much more easily by himself than with the hobbled Booth, stayed true to his companion and returned to the Garrett farm the next afternoon. Did his hero worship know no bounds? Well, actually it did. Booth was allowed to sleep late, and when he finally arose, he found himself in idyllic circumstances. The weather had turned unseasonably warm. The unsuspecting Garrett family welcomed him into its bosom, and he rewarded them with the irresistible Booth charm. He played on the lawn with the children, and particularly took to 3-year-old Cora, whom he called his little blue-eyed pet. However, when they sat down to eat early in the afternoon, things turned a bit ominous. Brother John returned from an errand with exciting news. The rumors about the killing of President Lincoln were true, he said. Someone told him there was a $140,000 reward for capture of the assassin. Brother William said, "You better not come this way or he will be gobbled up." Booth didn't blink. "How much was that again?" he asked. $140,000, said William. I would sooner suppose more like 500,000, Booth offered. Still, it seems he gave the Garretts no cause for second thoughts until later in the afternoon. When some riders neared the property, John Garrett assumed they were the soldiers who accompanied Booth the day before. But Booth asked him to retrieve his gun belt from the bedstead. When John asked why, Booth snapped, "You go and get my pistols." John went to the bedroom, but looking out the window, he saw that the riders had passed on by. He returned without the weapons. 5 minutes later, a solitary pedestrian with a gun slung over his shoulder entered at the gate and walked toward the house. This time, Booth told John's 11-year-old brother Richard to get his guns right away. Richard obliged him immediately. Booth strapped on his belt, which held 2 large revolvers and his bowie knife, and crutched out to meet the stranger. It was Davy Herold. They spoke for several minutes before approaching the house. Herold told Booth at this point that he was tired of this life and wanted to go home. Booth said, no, they were spending the night here. Returning to the porch, the supposed John D. Boyd introduced to John Garrett his cousin, David E. Boyd, not brother, as Herold had said earlier to the soldiers. Had Booth demoted Herold from brother to cousin because the latter was showing the white feather? Well, maybe he just thought it was more believable, given the obvious dissimilarity of their appearances. He asked the Garretts if David could spend the night too. But John Garrett had grown suspicious from the events of the past quarter hour. In a purposely brusque tone, he told them that he could not take David in without the say-so of his father, who was away. Davy said he didn't mind waiting and sat down on the porch steps. Waiting, however, was the wrong plan. The searchers were closing in. The day before, acting on intelligence reporting that Booth and Herold had crossed the Potomac, 25 troopers of the 16th New York Cavalry disembarked from Washington with their lieutenant, Edward Dougherty, and 2 detectives, Luther Baker and Everton Conger. They traveled by steamboat to Belle Plaine, Virginia, and rode south, combing the countryside. The next day, around the time that Booth was theorizing about Lincoln's assassin at the Garrett dinner table, the Federals arrived at Port Conway. The detectives talked to a fisherman, William Rollins, who lived near the ferry, and his black employee, showing them pictures of Booth, Herold, and John Surratt. Yes, they recognized 2 of them from the day before. This was incredibly good news. But it got better. The fisherman's wife said it should be easy to find them because they were with Willie Jett, who was undoubtedly on his way to see his girlfriend. This was such good news. Taking Rollins as a guide, he asked to be handcuffed for appearance's sake, the troop immediately called for the ferry. It was on the other side of the river. Plus, he could only take 9 horses and men at a time. They needed 3 back-and-forth trips to get everyone on the same side of the Rappahannock as the conspirators. That's all right, we can wait. The riders that Booth and John Garrett saw riding past the Garrett farm were 2 of the soldiers who had brought Booth to the farm the day before. They were on the road to the ferry. However, when they crested a rise before getting to the river, they saw the Union soldiers in the process of getting the whole detail across. It didn't take much guessing what they were in Port Royal for. Realizing they had been sighted, the 2 turned around and tore down the road. When they reached the farm, they shouted, "Marylanders, you had better watch out. There are 40 Yankee cavalry coming up the hill." Actually 25, but whatever. Having done their patriotic duty of warning the assassinators of the president of their peril, they dashed away. John Wilkes and Davy made for the woods behind the Garrett house. Several minutes later, they came back. No cavalry had come thundering down the road. But John Garrett had learned from another passerby that they were on their way. Garrett didn't like the way this was shaping up, and he took Herold to task. "I told him," he later related, "that since he had come here, my suspicions were aroused that all was not right with him and Booth, and I would be very glad if they would leave our house, for we are peaceable citizens and did not want to get into any difficulty." Herold was reassuring. "There is no danger," he laughed. "Don't make yourselves alarmed about it. We will not get you into any trouble." But as they bickered, the cavalry did come thundering down the road. They paid no mind, however, to Garrett and Herold in the front yard of the farmhouse. William Rollins was guiding them to Bowling Green, home of Izora Goldman, Willie Jett's 16-year-old girlfriend. They arrived there at about 11 p.m. The Federals surrounded the Goldman house, and after some Keystone Cops-like antics, they were led to where Willie Jett was sharing a mattress with Izora's brother. Waking him roughly and putting the fear of God in him every way they knew how, they hustled him downstairs. Lieutenant Dougherty later testified, "We informed him of our business, telling him if he did not forthwith inform us where the men were, he should suffer." Jett's fear overcame his loyalty to the assassinator who wrote him a poem. Actually, I should have mentioned that Herold wrote him a poem too. Asking to speak to one of the detectives alone, he told him exactly where Booth was staying and offered to guide them there. Detective Conger was incredulous that they had just passed the place. At 12:30 a.m. on April 25th, they mounted up and headed back. The morning before, at the farm, Booth had spun a yarn about how he and Herold had exchanged shots with some Yankee cavalry, apparently to lend plausibility to just such a pursuit as became evident later that day. But John Garrett was no longer amused. He once again asked Herold to leave. They discussed how to convey the Boyds away, but there were no horses to be bought, the war having used up every available quadruped, and a neighbor with a wagon for hire wasn't home. It looked like the Boyds were staying for supper. Supper wasn't the pleasant gathering that Booth had experienced the night before. He brought up again how useful it would be to have mounts, which raised John Garrett's suspicions to a higher pitch. He was now fairly convinced that their guests meant to steal some Garrett horses. After supper, Davy dug him and Booth a deeper pit by telling a passel of lies about his supposed military service. He even named his unit and captain. John Garrett called him out. He knew the regiment, and it had no such captain. Davy reconsidered. To tell you the truth, he lied, I was there only 1 week. I was then on picket, and the first night I was wounded. The long and short of it was that when bedtime came, the Boyd cousins were surprised to learn that there would be no bed for them. We'll sleep under the house then, said the imperturbable Herold. No, the dogs slept under the house and would probably bite them. Well, what's in the barn then? There was hay and fodder. We'll sleep in the barn then, decided Herold, and he and Booth headed that way. John and William acquiesced, but once the overstayed guests were in the barn, the Garrett brothers quietly locked it from the outside. John and William headed for bed, but then decided it would be better to keep an eye on their captives. They took blankets to a corn house near the barn, which they called the tobacco house. It was built for drying tobacco and thus had gaps between the slats that walled it. All was quiet for a few hours. I, honest to gosh, thought I was going to get to Booth's dying words in this episode. But you have gotten to know these characters, and you deserve to get more of the details of this climactic event, for which there is a very rich record. We are getting very near the end, though, for John Wilkes Booth. But the full conspirator story won't be over then, not by a long chalk. See you next time for The Conspirators, Part 13.